Imagine walking into a high-end restaurant, dressed sharp, expecting nothing more than a good meal, only to be turned away at the door. No explanation, no apology, just a look that says you don't belong here. But what if the man they dismissed wasn't just another customer? What if he was the owner, secretly testing his own staff? What happens next will shock everyone in that room, and change the restaurant forever. The evening air outside Le Jardin was crisp, carrying a faint aroma of fresh bread and seared steak as Ethan Carter stepped toward the entrance. The restaurant's golden lettering gleamed under the soft glow of the streetlights. Exuding exclusivity, it was the kind of place where whispers carried weight and where polished silverware clinked softly against porcelain plates as conversations hummed in muted elegance. Ethan had been here before, but never like this. He adjusted the cuff of his dark blue blazer, one that was refined yet intentionally understated. His usual presence as CEO of Carter Hospitality Group came with immediate recognition. But tonight, he was just another customer. No security, no personal assistant, just him and a quiet purpose. Reports had reached his desk detailing complaints of discrimination within this very establishment. Subtle enough to be ignored by those unwilling to look closer, yet loud enough to warrant his attention. Instead of relying on second-hand accounts, he had decided to see it with his own eyes. As he stepped inside, warmth enveloped him, the ambient lighting casting a golden hue over the marble floors. Chandeliers glistening above impeccably dressed patrons sipping their wine. A soft melody played in the background, the kind meant to lull guests into a sense of belonging. Ethan made his way toward the host stand, where a young man in a crisp black suit stood behind a gleaming wooden podium. Jason White barely spared Ethan a glance as he approached. The host's blonde hair was neatly combed back, his suit perfectly pressed, but there was something about his posture, his subtle stiffness, the way his fingers drummed lightly against the surface of the podium, that hinted at a certain guardedness. "Good evening," Ethan said, offering a polite nod. "I'd like a table for one, please." Jason looked him up and down, his eyes flitting to the blazer, then the shoes, assessing, calculating. A pause stretched between them, just long enough to be noticeable. "I'm sorry, sir," Jason finally said, his tone clipped. "We're fully booked tonight. No available tables." Ethan glanced over Jason's shoulder. Several tables sat empty, their pristine white tablecloths undisturbed, wineglasses standing ready. He kept his expression neutral. "You're sure?" he asked, his voice calm. "I see some open tables." Jason's lips pressed together briefly before he exhaled through his nose. "Those are reserved for VIP guests. I'm afraid we can't make any exceptions." Ethan held the man's gaze, searching for any flicker of hesitation, some sign that Jason was aware of what he was doing. But there was none. The confidence in his dismissal was absolute, as if this were simply business as usual. Ethan didn't argue. Instead, he turned slightly, stepping aside just enough to observe. A minute passed, then two. The front doors swung open again, and in walked another guest, a man in his mid-50s. Dressed in a pale gray suit, he approached the podium with an easy stride, his polished leather shoes clicking softly against the floor. Ethan didn't need to hear the words exchange. He saw it in the way Jason's demeanor changed, the sudden brightness in his expression, the effortless smile, the way he reached for a menu before the man had even asked. Within seconds, Jason was leading him toward a prime table near the windows, one of the very ones he had just claimed to be unavailable. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he forced his body to remain relaxed. He had seen enough. Without another word, he turned and walked out, stepping back into the cool night air. His hands slid into his pockets as he took a slow breath. Some part of him had expected, perhaps even hoped, that the reports were exaggerated. But now, there was no doubt. Tomorrow, he would return, and this time, it wouldn't be as a nameless guest. Ethan leaned back in his office chair, the city skyline stretching out beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows. The lights of downtown flickered in the night, but his attention was fixed on the glowing screen in front of him. The security footage from Le Jardin loaded frame by frame, each moment captured in crisp high definition. He clicked through the timestamps, his fingers steady, his eyes sharp. There it was, a man and woman, both black, standing at the host stand. The man spoke first, gesturing slightly as if explaining something. Jason White, in his crisp black suit, listened with a neutral expression. But his body language told a different story. The slight arch of his brow, the way his fingers tapped impatiently against the podium, the quick glance toward the open tables behind him. Then, the shake of his head, the polite but firm dismissal. No tables available. Less than 10 minutes later, a white couple arrived, dressed no differently than the first two guests. This time, Jason's demeanor transformed. He smiled, nodded, and within moments, led them to a prime spot by the window. Ethan exhaled slowly, pressing his lips together. It wasn't a one-time incident. It was a pattern. He grabbed his phone and dialed Ava Mitchell, his director of operations. It rang twice before she picked up. "You're calling late," she said, her voice carrying a mixture of curiosity and concern. "I need you to pull up all customer complaints from Le Jardin over the past 6 months." Ethan said, specifically, anything about service discrimination. There was a pause, the sound of papers shuffling in the background. "I can tell you right now we've had a few," she admitted. "I remember flagging a couple of them. But nothing ever came of it." That wasn't surprising. Complaints like these could easily be buried if the right people weren't paying attention. "I want a full report on my desk by morning," Ethan said, "and I need to know if management took any action at all." "I'll get on it," Ava promised. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Ethan said, his voice measured, "that I need to do more than fire one bad employee." The next afternoon, Ethan stepped into Le Jardin once again. This time, there was no pretense. He wore a tailored navy suit, his presence commanding without effort. The staff, accustomed to seeing him only at high-level meetings, immediately recognized him. Conversations quieted, glances flickered in his direction. But it was Jason White's reaction that held Ethan's attention. The man went pale. His hands gripped the podium a little tighter, his posture stiffening. Ethan walked toward him with deliberate steps, stopping just inches from the stand. "I'd like a table," Ethan said, his tone calm but firm. Jason swallowed, his throat bobbing visibly. Sir, do you have a reservation?" Ethan tilted his head slightly, a slow smile forming. "I don't need one, because I own this restaurant." A murmur rippled through the staff. Jason's face drained of color entirely, and he fumbled for words. Before he could stammer out an excuse, Ethan turned to Richard Hayes, the general manager, who had just stepped out from the back. "Richard," Ethan said, his voice carrying through the room, "I want a meeting, right now." Richard hesitated, his eyes darting between Jason and Ethan. But there was no room for refusal. A storm was coming. The private meeting room of Le Jardin was silent except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. The walls, adorned with muted artwork and mahogany paneling, gave the space a refined but oppressive air. Ethan sat at the head of the long conference table, his posture composed but commanding. Across from him sat Jason White, his hands clasped tightly in his lap, eyes darting toward Richard Hayes, who remained still, his expression unreadable. A few other senior staff members occupied the remaining seats, their unease evident in the way they shifted in their chairs. Ethan let the silence stretch for a moment longer before he reached into his leather portfolio. Pulling out a neatly stacked folder, he set it on the table with deliberate calm, the sound of paper against wood cutting through the tension. He tapped the cover once before speaking, his voice level but carrying the weight of authority. "I want to hear your explanation, Jason," he said, his gaze locking onto the host. "Why did you refuse me a table last night?" Jason exhaled slowly, his fingers tightening around each other. "It was a busy night," he said, forcing a polite tone. "We had several VIP reservations. I must have. There might have been a mix-up." Ethan didn't react. He merely lifted the remote beside him and pressed a button. The large screen mounted on the wall flickered to life, displaying a time-stamped security feed. The room remained eerily silent as the footage played. There was Jason at the podium, speaking to Ethan, his face impassive. Then came the moment of dismissal, followed by Ethan stepping aside. A few seconds later, a white customer approached, the same polished demeanor. No reservation. Jason's entire demeanor shifted. A warm smile, a swift welcome, and an immediate escort to one of the so-called unavailable tables. The footage ended, leaving nothing but the uncomfortable rustling of fabric as Jason shifted in his chair. Ethan turned back to him. "That doesn't look like a mix-up to me." Jason's jaw twitched. He hesitated, then glanced toward Richard, who remained frustratingly quiet. His hesitation spoke volumes. Jason began, then stopped, his shoulders lifted in a useless shrug. "I didn't mean anything by it. I was just following the usual standards of." Ethan leaned forward, lacing his fingers together. "The usual standards of what? Exactly?" Jason swallowed, but Richard was the one to finally break his silence. "Ethan, let's not blow this out of proportion," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "I understand the optics here, but I can assure you, our staff does not operate on discriminatory policies." Ethan turned his gaze toward Richard, studying him. "Then explain this," he said, reaching for another document from the folder. He slid it across the table. Customer complaints, multiple reports, all describing the same pattern of behavior. Each one dismissed without action. "You want to tell me why that is?" Richard's fingers hovered over the paper before he finally picked it up. Scanning the contents, his throat moved as he swallowed. "I wasn't aware." "That's not true." Ava Mitchell cut in. She had been sitting quietly at Ethan's right, but now she leaned forward. "I flagged these issues months ago. I sent emails. You ignored them." Richard's mouth opened, then shut. His fingers tensed against the edge of the complaint sheet. Jason, sensing the shift in momentum, turned slightly in his seat, suddenly looking far less sure of himself. Ethan exhaled through his nose. Measured, controlled. "So let's get to the real truth," he said, folding his hands once more. "You knew, and you let it slide because Jason is your friend." The words landed like a stone in the room. Richard stiffened, his jaw locking. Jason, no longer able to rely on his superior's silence, finally looked stricken. A few of the other staff members, who had remained quiet up until now, exchanged glances. One, a server named Daniel, shifted uncomfortably before speaking up. "I saw it happen," he admitted, his voice hesitant but firm. "Not just last night. It's been going on for a while." But, his fingers tapped against the table. "I didn't think I could say anything without putting my job at risk." Another employee nodded in agreement. "We all knew," she said quietly. "We just didn't think anything would change." Ethan absorbed their words, his face unreadable. Then, slowly, he straightened his posture. "Things are changing now." He turned back to Jason. "Effective immediately. You're fired. Your behavior is a direct violation of our policies. And there is no room for that in this company." Jason didn't protest. He looked between Ethan and Richard. But there was no ally left for him. His face burned red, his lips pressed into a thin line as he rose from his chair and walked out without another word. Ethan shifted his attention to Richard. "As for you, you're suspended pending a full investigation. If I find out this was part of a larger culture of discrimination, you won't just be out of a job, you'll be answering for it in court." Richard's face was a mask of barely contained frustration. But he nodded stiffly. Ethan exhaled, then turned to the rest of the room. "We're going to fix this. That means an internal audit, new oversight policies, and mandatory training. And if I find out anyone else has been enabling this behavior, they'll be out the door just as fast." No one spoke, no one argued. The weight of the moment had settled over them. And they all understood, this wasn't a warning. It was a reckoning. As Ethan stood to leave, he glanced once more at Richard, who remained seated, his expression dark. This wasn't over. By the time Ethan walked out of the boardroom and into the crisp evening air, the story had already started to spread. He wasn't on social media much, but Ava had called him not long after he left the restaurant. Her voice unusually sharp. "It's everywhere," she said. Someone recorded the meeting. He had barely made it home before his phone started buzzing with notifications. A short video, shaky but clear enough, showed him standing at the head of the table in LaJardin's private meeting room. His voice steady as he addressed Jason White. The clip cut just before Jason stormed out, leaving behind stunned silence. Within hours, it had racked up thousands of views. At first, the comments were mixed. Some praised him for taking action, calling him a leader with integrity. Others questioned whether this was a publicity stunt, whether he would have acted if he hadn't been personally affected. But as more people shared their experiences, the conversation took a turn. Former customers of Le Jardin and other restaurants under the Carter Hospitality Group started commenting. Some described being treated differently based on their appearance. Others spoke about subtle indignities, being seated near the kitchen when other tables were open, receiving slower service than their white counterparts, or being asked to prepay for meals when no one else was. Then came the bigger stories. News outlets picked up the video. Headlines ranged from neutral to damning, some framing it as a wake-up call for the hospitality industry, others painting Le Jardin as a symptom of a larger problem. By the next morning, the restaurant's front desk was inundated with calls. Customers canceled reservations. A petition began circulating, demanding accountability, calling for Ethan to do more than fire a single employee. Inside the restaurant, tension rippled through the staff. Some whispered anxiously about job security, fearing the backlash would shut down the business. Others, especially those who had long felt uncomfortable with the way things operated, saw it as an overdue reckoning. Ethan knew they had to move fast. By noon, he was in a conference room at the Carter Hospitality Group headquarters, a glass-walled space overlooking downtown. Ava sat across from him, her laptop open, scrolling through real-time reactions. Next to her, the head of the company's PR team, Mark Holloway, ran a hand through his graying hair. "We need to get ahead of this," Mark said, "before it turns into something we can't control." Ethan already had a plan. He leaned forward, fingers laced together. "We start with a statement," he said, "an apology, not just from the restaurant, but from me. We don't sugarcoat it. We acknowledge the issue, and we lay out exactly what we're going to do to fix it." Mark nodded slowly. "A corporate apology only works if people believe you mean it. We'll need more than words." Ava glanced up from her screen. "There's already a push for a boycott," she said. "We need to make sure this isn't just damage control. People want real change." Ethan tapped a pen against the table. "Then let's give it to them." That afternoon, a statement went live on the Carter Hospitality Group's website and across their social media platforms. Ethan's name was attached to every word. "We have failed our customers. Discrimination, whether subtle or overt, has no place in our restaurants. And yet it happened under my leadership. That is unacceptable." Effective immediately, we are implementing a zero-tolerance policy for discriminatory practices in all Carter Hospitality Group establishments. The message went on to outline concrete steps. Every employee, from hosts to senior managers, would undergo mandatory training on bias and equitable service. A third-party oversight committee would be brought in to review company policies. And, perhaps most notably, a direct hotline would be established for customers to report any future incidents. By the evening news cycle, the statement had been dissected, analyzed, and debated. Some called it performative, others said it was a step in the right direction. But the one thing Ethan hadn't expected was what came next. Ava's phone buzzed as they wrapped up a late meeting. She glanced at the screen, then frowned. "This just came in," she said, turning the phone toward him. The email was unsigned, no sender name attached, but the message was clear. "Jason wasn't the only one. There are others. You've only scratched the surface." Ethan felt the familiar weight of exhaustion press against his ribs. But beneath it was something sharper. This wasn't just about one employee, or even one restaurant. It was about an entire system, one that had been allowed to thrive in silence for too long. And now, the silence was breaking. Ethan Carter sat at his desk, staring at the email on his screen. The anonymous message was short, direct. Jason White wasn't the only one. There were others, employees who had followed the same unspoken rules, prioritizing certain guests while subtly pushing others away. Ethan had suspected as much, but seeing it spelled out in front of him solidified his next move. The morning after the email arrived, he called a meeting with Ava Mitchell and David Lynn. The conference room was quiet, save for the occasional clicking of Ava's laptop as she pulled up reports. David, a meticulous man known for his ability to spot inconsistencies in operational data, flipped through a thick file in front of him. "We're not treating this like an isolated incident," Ethan said. "We need a full-scale internal review, and I want it done quickly." Ava nodded. "We'll start by reviewing security footage. If there's a pattern, it'll show up there. David adjusted his glasses. I'll have IT pull the reservation history. If certain names or demographics keep getting pushed to the waitlist while others get immediate seating, we'll know. Ethan leaned forward. And I want anonymous interviews with the staff, past and present. If there's a systemic problem, people will have seen it. They just need to know it's safe to talk. The investigation began that afternoon. The IT team compiled months of booking data, while Ava and David met with employees one by one, assuring them of confidentiality. Ethan spent the day reviewing past complaints, highlighting patterns that had been dismissed as misunderstandings. By the end of the second day, the picture was becoming clear. The security footage showed multiple instances of black customers being turned away or given less desirable seating while white guests were accommodated without hesitation. The booking records painted an even starker contrast. Customers of color were disproportionately marked as walk-ins. Their reservations often misplaced or labeled as no-shows. Then came the testimony. Several employees admitted, in hushed voices, that they had noticed the pattern but never questioned it. Some were afraid of losing their jobs. Others had convinced themselves it was just a coincidence. But a few, particularly a young server named Lily Carter, had more to say. Lily had worked at Le Jardin for 3 years. She wasn't related to Ethan, but she shared his last name and, apparently, his unwillingness to look the other way. Late that evening, she asked to meet Ava in private. "There's something you need to hear," she said, sliding her phone across the table. Ava pressed play. The recording was muffled at first, but soon, a familiar voice filled the room. "Richard Hayes. I don't want any troublemakers in here," he was saying. "You know the type. They sit too long, complain too much, don't tip well. If you see someone who looks like they're going to be a problem, find a way to move them along. If a VIP walks in and we need to free up a table, you know who to pick first." Lily's voice, quiet but firm, cut in. "You mean black customers?" A pause. Then Richard's sigh. "I mean people who make things difficult. And yes, that tends to be them. Not always, but enough." Ava closed her eyes briefly, then exhaled. This wasn't just a problem with a few bad employees. It was policy. The next morning, Ethan called a meeting with Richard Hayes. The general manager arrived looking defensive, his arms crossed before he even sat down. He barely waited for Ethan to start before launching into his own argument. "You're making this bigger than it is," Richard said. "This is a fine dining restaurant. We prioritize regulars and high-spending guests. That's how it works." Ethan studied him. "Are you saying race has nothing to do with it?" Richard hesitated, just for a second. Then, with forced confidence, he shook his head. "I'm saying we take care of our best customers. The ones who tip well. The ones who don't start problems." Ethan reached for his phone, played the recording. Richard's face paled slightly, his mouth opened, but no words came out. "Anything you want to add?" Ethan asked. For the first time, Richard had no response. Ethan leaned back in his chair. "You're suspended, effective immediately. A full review is being conducted. And if I find out this extends beyond you, there will be more consequences." Richard stood abruptly, his jaw tight. "You think firing a few people is going to fix this?" Ethan met his gaze, steady and unwavering. "No. That's why I'm not just firing a few people. I'm changing the system that let this happen." Richard didn't say another word. He turned and walked out, leaving behind the weight of an era that was ending. Ethan knew the real work was just beginning. Ethan Carter had seen this coming. Richard Hayes wasn't the type to go quietly. Even before the official meeting was scheduled, the signs were there. A few board members who had previously remained neutral suddenly became hesitant. A well-respected financial journal ran a story questioning whether Ethan's leadership was too reactionary, hinting that his actions against Richard were more about personal retribution than systemic reform. By the time Ethan arrived at Carter Hospitality Group's downtown headquarters for the board meeting, the stakes had already been raised. This wasn't going to be a straightforward disciplinary action. Richard had made sure of that. The meeting room was filled with the soft murmur of conversation as the board members settled in. The long oak table gleamed under the recessed lighting, glasses of water placed neatly at every seat. Richard sat near the end of the table, arms crossed, his expression calm, as if this were just another routine discussion. but Ethan could see the calculation in his eyes. When the meeting officially began, Ethan wasted no time. He stood, placed a folder in front of him, and spoke clearly. The purpose of today's meeting is to address the findings of our internal investigation regarding the discriminatory practices at Le Jardin, specifically under Richard Hayes' management. He opened the folder and slid a copy of the report across the table. Watching as members flipped through the pages, Ava Mitchell controlled the screen at the far end of the room. Clicking through the key points: customer complaints, security footage, manipulated reservation records. Then came the final piece, the recording of Richard's own words, instructing employees on who to prioritize and who to push aside. A silence fell over the room when the recording ended. Some members looked uncomfortable, shifting in their seats. Others looked straight at Richard, waiting for his response. Richard leaned back, exhaling through his nose as if bored. Then he sat forward, resting his hands on the table. "You're blowing this out of proportion," he said, his tone smooth. "Every luxury restaurant has its way of managing clientele. That's not discrimination. That's business." Ethan's jaw tightened, but he let Richard speak. "The reality is," Richard continued, looking around at the board members, "we cater to high-value customers. We always have. That's how Carter Hospitality became a premier brand. And if we start turning our backs on those customers, we're going to feel it where it hurts most, our bottom line." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the room. That was the argument Richard had been pushing behind closed doors. Not outright denying the allegations, but reframing them as a necessary part of high-end hospitality. Ethan glanced toward James Donovan, one of the most influential board members. Donovan was in his 60s. Sharp-eyed and pragmatic, he had remained silent so far. Watching both sides, his vote would be critical. Ethan turned back to Richard. "You're not talking about customer service. You're talking about a culture that deliberately excludes certain groups of people based on assumptions and bias." Richard smirked. "That's a nice way of spinning it." He gestured toward the others. "But let's be honest. What Ethan is doing here is about more than just policy. This is a calculated PR move." He turned to Donovan. "Think about it. Since this story broke, who's been all over the media? Who's positioning himself as the face of change?" Ethan didn't flinch. He had expected this attack. "This isn't about publicity," he said. "This is about protecting the integrity of this company. We can't claim to be a leader in hospitality while allowing discrimination to go unchecked." A few members nodded in agreement. Others, however, hesitated. Ethan could see it in their expressions, the hesitation of people who knew what was right but feared the consequences of taking a stand. Richard pressed on. "If we go public with this, we risk alienating longtime patrons, not to mention potential investors. You really think they're going to want to be associated with a brand that's caught up in controversy?" That argument landed. Some members exchanged uneasy glances. Ethan kept his focus on Donovan. He needed to tip the scale. "James," Ethan said, addressing him directly, "this isn't just about one restaurant. This is about the entire company. If we sweep this under the rug, we're sending a message to every employee and customer that this behavior is acceptable. That's not just bad ethics, it's bad business. The world is changing, customers are paying attention, and they won't forget how we handle this." Donovan studied Ethan for a long moment, then looked at Richard, who was waiting for his own confirmation of support. Then, finally, Donovan spoke. "I want to hear what the rest of the board thinks before I decide." Ethan clenched his jaw but nodded. The battle wasn't won yet. The private lounge of the Hamilton Club exuded quiet luxury. A mahogany bar stretched along the far wall, polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the soft glow of pendant lights. A few men in tailored suits occupied the deep leather chairs, murmuring over glasses of aged whiskey. It was the kind of place where decisions that never made it to official boardrooms were quietly settled over a well-poured drink. Ethan Carter sat at a corner table, his fingers resting lightly on the rim of his glass, though he had no intention of drinking. Across from him, James Donovan reclined slightly in his chair, the flickering candlelight casting deep lines across his weathered face. He had the look of a man who had seen countless battles in the corporate world and survived them all. "You wanted to talk," Donovan said, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. His voice was calm, detached, as if this were just another routine discussion. Ethan leaned forward. I need to know where you stand. Donovan exhaled slowly, taking a sip before setting his drink down with deliberate ease. You think this is about ethics, don't you? He mused. That if you present me with the right moral argument, I'll suddenly see the light. He gave a small, knowing smile. Let's be clear. I don't make decisions based on morality. I make them based on numbers. Ethan had expected this. He had done his research. James Donovan had built his career by making the kind of choices that prioritized profit above all else. But that didn't mean he was untouchable. Then let's talk numbers, Ethan said. Public perception is shifting. Consumers care about corporate values more than ever. The data is clear. Brands that ignore social responsibility are losing ground. If we keep Richard, we risk permanent damage to the Carter Hospitality name. Donovan studied him, his fingers tapping lightly against the table. And if we get rid of him? Ethan slid a report across the table, pages filled with statistics on consumer spending habits, brand loyalty trends, and case studies of companies that had suffered after mishandling public scandals. We take control of the narrative. We position ourselves as leaders in ethical hospitality. We don't just avoid damage, we gain market trust. That translates to higher revenue, stronger partnerships, and long-term growth. Donovan flipped through the report, skimming the key figures. His expression remained unreadable, but Ethan could see the wheels turning. After a moment, he closed the folder and looked up. I already knew about Lejardin, Donovan admitted, his voice almost casual. This kind of thing isn't unique to us. It happens across the industry. The reason I never raised an issue? It was working. Ethan's jaw tightened, but he stayed silent, letting Donovan continue. The reality is, Donovan said, lacing his fingers together, our top spenders didn't care. And as long as they didn't care, neither did I. But now, people are watching. Now, there's risk. He studied Ethan for a long moment. So here's my position. You have 1 week. Convince me that your so-called reforms will be better for business than keeping things the way they are. If you can do that, I'll back you. If not, he let the words hang in the air. Ethan understood the unspoken threat. If he failed to deliver a compelling case, Donovan would side with Richard, and Ethan's efforts would crumble before they even had a chance to succeed. He stood, buttoning his jacket, his mind already turning over strategies. You'll have your answer in a week. Donovan lifted his glass in a mock toast. I look forward to it. As Ethan stepped out onto the city street, the air was thick with the scent of rain. The pavement still damp from an earlier drizzle. He inhaled deeply, the weight of the coming days settling on his shoulders. This wasn't just about removing Richard anymore. It was about proving that change wasn't just the right thing to do, it was the smart thing. And he only had 7 days to make that case. The morning after his meeting with James Donovan, Ethan Carter sat in the conference room at Carter Hospitality Group's headquarters, staring at the city skyline through the towering glass windows. He had 1 week, 7 days to dismantle a system that had been quietly thriving under his leadership without him even realizing it. 7 days to prove that change wasn't just necessary but profitable. Ava Mitchell sat across from him, flipping through a thick stack of reports. To her right, David Lynn adjusted his glasses, scanning the latest market trends. The rest of the marketing and operations team sat in tense silence, waiting for direction. Ethan leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. We're not treating this like damage control, he said. We're treating it like an opportunity. Ava nodded, setting down the reports. We go on the offensive. If we let the narrative get away from us, Richard will control the conversation. We need to be the ones defining what this company stands for. David tapped a page in front of him. The data supports it. Consumer spending trends show that customers, especially younger demographics, are choosing businesses that align with their values. If we want to stay relevant, we have to embrace this shift. Ethan exhaled, then outlined the plan. The first step was a bold public relations campaign. Carter Hospitality Group would announce a sweeping initiative to reform its customer service policies, implementing mandatory training across all locations to eliminate bias in hospitality. The announcement wouldn't be vague, it would include specific, measurable steps. The second step was replacing Richard. It wasn't enough to remove him. They had to appoint a new general manager at Lejardin who symbolized progress, Someone who could execute the new vision and rebuild trust. The third step was visibility. They needed an event, something public, something undeniable, a high-profile relaunch of Le Jardin under the new service policies, with invitations extended to industry leaders, journalists, and influencers. The goal was to make a statement. This wasn't a temporary fix. It was a long-term commitment. Finally, the fourth step was external partnerships. Ethan proposed aligning with organizations that championed equity in business practices. By actively working with these groups, Carter Hospitality wouldn't just talk about change, they would prove they were serious about it. As Ethan laid out the plan, heads around the table nodded in agreement. The mood shifted. This wasn't just about crisis management anymore. It was about redefining what the company could be. But Richard wasn't going to sit back and let it happen. Later that evening, Ethan received a call from one of the board members. Richard had been making his own moves. He had reached out to key investors, warning them that Ethan's aggressive overhaul could alienate the high-end clientele that had defined Carter Hospitality's reputation. He painted the reforms as a radical shift that would upset their most loyal patrons. More than that, he was working from within. Certain mid-level managers, those who had benefited from the old system, were being quietly influenced. If they pushed back against Ethan's changes, it would create the illusion that resistance wasn't just coming from Richard, but from within the company itself. Ethan knew a confrontation was inevitable. At the next internal meeting, the tension was palpable. A few managers, those Richard had gotten to, voiced their concerns. They framed it as practicality. They worried that shaking up the company's core service model would create uncertainty, that longtime patrons would feel alienated. Ava, ever prepared, slid a report onto the table. Actually, she said, her voice sharp, our revenue data says otherwise. She pointed to a graph showing a slow decline in spending from older, traditionally wealthier clientele. The guests you're worried about losing? They're already spending less. Meanwhile, the demographics that are growing, the ones increasing their spending in hospitality, are younger and more diverse. Ethan folded his hands in front of him, meeting their eyes one by one. We're not taking a risk. We're adapting. If we cling to outdated models, we're the ones who will get left behind. The argument landed. The pushback softened. But the battle wasn't over. That night, another leak hit the press. A damning email surfaced, one directly from Richard, instructing employees to prioritize white customers and delay reservations for black patrons whenever possible. The fallout was immediate. It wasn't just an internal issue anymore. The media latched onto it, calling it proof of deep-seated discrimination within Carter Hospitality. Social media exploded with outrage. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the breaking news alerts. He had been planning his next move carefully, but now the moment had arrived sooner than expected. Richard had made himself untouchable for years. Now, he was out of time. The boardroom at Carter Hospitality Group headquarters was silent except for the faint hum of the air conditioning. Outside, the city moved as it always did. But inside these walls, the fate of one of the company's top executives was being decided. Ethan Carter stood at the head of the long conference table, scanning the faces of the gathered board members. Some were expectant, some hesitant, and a few openly skeptical. At the far end of the table sat Richard Hayes, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression composed but his eyes sharp with calculation. Ava Mitchell sat to Ethan's right, her laptop open, the screen angled slightly away from view. James Donovan sat near the middle, unreadable as always. His decision would be pivotal. Ethan cleared his throat and began. We're here today to address the ongoing investigation into discriminatory practices under Richard Hayes' management. The evidence speaks for itself. This is no longer a question of perception. It's a question of accountability. Richard leaned back in his chair, exhaling as if this were all an inconvenience rather than a career-threatening meeting. Let's not get dramatic, he said smoothly. I'd like to remind the board that these so-called leaked emails haven't been verified. In today's digital age, it's easy to manipulate information. A smear campaign against me doesn't change the fact that I've delivered consistent revenue growth for this company. A few board members exchanged glances. Some nodded slightly, seemingly swayed by his argument. Others remained neutral, waiting to see how the discussion unfolded. Ethan didn't react immediately. Instead, He tapped a folder in front of him. "I figured you'd say that," he said, flipping it open. "That's why we didn't rely on just one source." He gestured toward Ava, who pressed a button on her laptop. The large screen at the front of the room lit up with a financial report. "This," Ethan continued, "is a breakdown of revenue trends over the past 5 years. While on the surface, profits from Le Jardin have been stable, there's a clear decline in repeat customers from younger, more diverse demographics. The numbers don't lie. The business model Richard has been enforcing isn't just unethical, it's unsustainable." David Lynn, head of quality control, spoke up. "We also conducted a full audit of customer complaints. Many of them were never properly addressed. Some were outright buried." He glanced toward Richard, whose smirk had faded slightly. The shift in the room was subtle but noticeable. The initial hesitancy was beginning to crack. Richard adjusted his tie, his voice still controlled but carrying a harder edge. "With all due respect, our clientele has always been high-end. Our priority is making sure they receive the best service possible. If we start restructuring everything based on a few bad PR moments, we're going to alienate the people who have built this company's reputation." Ethan held his gaze. "We're not talking about PR. We're talking about systemic discrimination. And we're talking about the future of this company. If we continue operating this way, we're the ones who will be left behind." Before Richard could respond, Ava spoke again. "And let's be clear, this wasn't just a passive issue. We have direct testimony confirming that these policies were not just tolerated but actively enforced." The door to the boardroom opened, and a woman stepped inside. She was in her late 30s, dressed professionally but with an air of quiet confidence. She walked with purpose, her gaze locking onto Richard the moment she entered. Ethan recognized her immediately. She had been one of the customers denied service at Le Jardin the night he had gone undercover. "My name is Sophia Langston," she said, placing a folder on the table. "I used to work for Carter Hospitality years ago, and I was also a customer at Le Jardin. Both times, I experienced firsthand what Richard Hayes allowed to happen." She opened the folder, revealing printouts of emails, internal communications between Richard and other senior staff members. They detailed efforts to suppress complaints, to ensure that only certain clientele were prioritized. Richard's face finally betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. He glanced toward Donovan, then back at Ethan. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "Anyone can fabricate documents." Ethan didn't respond. Instead, he turned to Donovan, who had remained quiet throughout the meeting. The older man exhaled, tapping a finger against the table. Then he looked at Richard. "We can't keep you," he said simply. "This is beyond repair." The room stilled. Richard blinked, as if he hadn't heard correctly. "What?" Donovan folded his hands. "You're out. The board will vote. But I'm telling you now, you don't have the numbers to survive this." Silence stretched as the reality sank in. One by one, the board members exchanged looks before murmuring their agreement. Richard's jaw tightened. He stood, smoothing his suit jacket. "You think you've won," he said, his voice low. He looked at Ethan with something between resentment and amusement. "But business isn't that simple. And neither is power." Without waiting for a response, he turned and walked out. Ethan remained still, watching him go. He knew this wasn't the last time Richard Hayes would make trouble. But for now, he was out of Carter Hospitality, and the real work of rebuilding was about to begin. The fallout from Richard Hayes' dismissal was immediate. News outlets dissected every angle of the decision, some praising Ethan Carter's firm stance, while others questioned whether this was simply a calculated public relations move. Headlines ranged from celebratory to skeptical. One article in a major business journal lauded the Carter Hospitality Group for taking a leadership role in corporate accountability. Another, more critical piece, framed the decision as reactive rather than proactive, suggesting that Ethan had only acted under pressure from public scrutiny. Social media was just as divided. Younger customers and those who had long felt unwelcome in upscale establishments flooded the company's pages with support, praising the policy changes and pledging loyalty to the brand. Some even shared personal stories about feeling excluded at high-end restaurants, calling Ethan's actions long overdue. But then there were the dissenters, longtime patrons, the kind Richard had always catered to, who felt blindsided. At one of the company's flagship restaurants, a regular customer, An older man in a tailored suit waved away a server and muttered under his breath, "So now we're punishing success? Prioritizing the wrong kind of people?" It wasn't just an isolated complaint. Within days, a small but vocal group of Carter Hospitality's elite clientele threatened to pull their business. Some canceled their memberships at the company's exclusive dining clubs, citing dissatisfaction with the new direction of the brand. A private email chain among high-net-worth individuals made its way to Ethan's desk, one where certain customers vented their frustration, calling the new policies unnecessary, even dangerous to the company's prestige. Ethan had anticipated backlash, but facing it head-on was another thing entirely. At the same time, shifts were happening internally. Some mid-level managers, those who had aligned themselves with Richard, quietly handed in their resignations. Whether they feared further scrutiny or simply disagreed with the company's new stance, Ethan didn't know, nor did he particularly care. He was already focused on the next step. Sitting across from Ava Mitchell in the executive conference room, he reviewed their plan for the upcoming weeks. "We can't stop at firing Richard," he said, flipping through a list of upcoming training sessions. "We have to rebuild this company from the ground up. No more unspoken rules, no more protected networks." Ava nodded, tapping a note into her tablet. "We're rolling out a new hiring framework. 2. No more senior leadership positions being filled based on personal connections. Everything will go through a transparent selection process." David Lynn leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. "That's going to take time. People who benefited from the old system won't just sit back and let it happen." Ethan exhaled, rubbing his temple. "I know, but we're not just trying to fix a PR problem. We're making sure this doesn't happen again." The first phase of their reform plan launched within days. Company-wide training programs were implemented, with mandatory sessions on equitable customer service. New hiring policies were outlined, emphasizing merit-based promotions. They announced an independent oversight board to ensure that every location adhered to the revised standards. The response was swift. Some employees welcomed the changes, relieved that the toxic environment Richard had cultivated was finally being addressed. Others were wary, skeptical that the reforms would last. Ethan knew trust wouldn't be rebuilt overnight. Then, just as things seemed to settle, an envelope arrived at Ethan's office. It was a thick, cream-colored packet, with no return address. His assistant handed it to him without a second thought. Ethan set it on his desk and carefully slid open the flap. Inside, he found a stack of old documents, neatly arranged. His eyes scanned the first page, an agreement, signed years ago, between Carter Hospitality Group and an unnamed financial entity. The wording was dense, filled with legal jargon, but one thing was clear. Richard Hayes had been involved in something far more significant than internal discrimination policies. Flipping through the pages, Ethan's stomach tightened. This wasn't just about LaJardin. This was about something bigger. Something hidden beneath the surface of the company he thought he knew. He leaned back in his chair, the weight of the documents heavy in his hands. The fight wasn't over. It had only just begun. The envelope sat unopened on Ethan Carter's desk for hours. He had skimmed through the first few pages, just enough to sense that whatever was inside had the potential to change everything. But something about it felt heavier than just words on paper. When the office grew quiet in the late evening, he finally called Ava Mitchell and David Lynn for a closed-door meeting. The three of them gathered in the executive conference room, the dim glow from the city skyline casting long shadows against the glass walls. Ethan spread the contract across the table. Ava's brow furrowed as she skimmed through the fine print, her fingers tapping impatiently against the pages. David, ever methodical, adjusted his glasses and began reading line by line. After a long silence, Ava exhaled sharply. "This isn't just a financial agreement," she said, her voice edged with disbelief. "This is influence, control." The contract was a long-standing partnership between Carter Hospitality Group and a private investment firm called Argonne Capital. On the surface, it appeared to be a standard funding agreement. Argonne provided financial backing in exchange for a percentage of high-tier revenue. But as Ethan flipped through the pages, a particular clause caught his attention. Argonne Capital had the authority to influence operational policies within Carter Hospitality's flagship locations, including customer prioritization strategies. The wording was careful, intentionally vague, But the meaning was clear. Argon had leveraged its position to shape how certain customers were treated. David's finger traced a highlighted passage. This explains why Richard got away with so much, he said quietly. It wasn't just him pushing these policies. He was following orders. Ava scoffed, pushing back from the table. This means the culture at Le Jardin wasn't just some outdated mindset, it was institutionalized. Engineered. Ethan leaned back, rubbing his temple. The implications were staggering. It meant that even after Richard was gone, the problem hadn't been eliminated. The system that allowed it to thrive was still very much intact. We have to cut ties, he said finally. Argon's control over this company ends now. But David wasn't convinced it would be that simple. He had already pulled up financial reports on his tablet, cross-referencing Argon's transactions with Carter Hospitality's revenue streams. As he dug deeper, his face darkened. This isn't just Le Jardin, he murmured. Look at this. Argon's influence extends to multiple locations. And these transactions, he pointed to a series of payments funneled into obscure accounts. There's money moving off the books. Large sums. Either we're looking at financial manipulation, or worse, bribes. Ava's eyes widened. Bribes for what? David hesitated, scrolling through figures, searching for a connection. I don't know yet, but if Argon has been pulling the strings for this long, then Richard was just the face of a much deeper operation. The weight of the revelation settled between them. What started as a battle against one executive's misconduct had transformed into something else entirely, an attempt to dismantle an entire power structure hidden within the company. Ethan closed the contract and looked at them both. We expose this, publicly. We sever every tie. Before Ava could respond, Ethan's phone vibrated on the table. A message. No name, no number. Just a single sentence. If you continue down this path, you won't just lose the company. You'll lose more than that. Silence filled the room. Ava inhaled slowly, her expression unreadable. David adjusted his glasses but said nothing. Ethan picked up the phone and stared at the message. The implications sinking in. This wasn't about business anymore. He had just stepped into something much bigger. And whoever was behind it was watching. Ethan Carter had been expecting pushback. But not like this. The moment he received that anonymous warning, small but unsettling changes began to ripple through his daily routine. People who had once been allies now seemed distant. Some board members who had supported his reforms suddenly avoided his calls. A critical meeting with a potential investor, one that had been locked in for weeks, was abruptly cancelled without explanation. At first, he thought it was paranoia. Then David Lynn called him late at night. I need you to come to my office, David said, his voice tense. Something isn't right. When Ethan arrived, David was hunched over his computer, his expression tight with frustration. He pointed to the screen. The financial report I was compiling, the one tracing Argon's transactions through our accounts? It's gone, completely wiped from the system. Ethan's stomach tightened. You're saying someone deleted it? David nodded. Not just deleted, erased. No backup. No trace in the logs. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. Ava Mitchell, who had been sitting quietly in the corner, pulled up a security feed on her tablet. I checked the building's surveillance records, she said, tilting the screen toward them. Someone accessed your office last night. David, no ID badge scan. No login records. Just a glitch in the system that lasted for 3 minutes. And then, poof, your files were gone. Ethan exhaled sharply. This wasn't just corporate sabotage. This was a calculated move. And then the phone call came. His personal line buzzed. And when he answered, a deep, composed voice greeted him. Ethan, I've been waiting for us to talk. He didn't recognize the number. But he knew exactly who it was. Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Argon Capital. You've been busy, Pierce continued, his tone laced with amusement. Digging into places you don't belong. Ethan gripped the phone tighter. If by that you mean investigating why your firm has been manipulating my company's operations for years, then yes, I've been busy. A soft chuckle. We don't care about your little crusade for fairness. Do what you want with your restaurants. Your policies, none of that concerns us. What concerns us is when someone like you starts interfering with the structure we put in place. That's when problems arise. Ethan's jaw tightened. I won't let Carter Hospitality be controlled by outside forces. Pierce's response was smooth, effortless. Then I suggest you think very carefully about your next steps. You have a lot to lose. Ethan. The call ended before he could respond. Ava and David were both staring at him when he put the phone down. What did he say? Ava asked. Ethan ran a hand over his face. He made a mistake. David frowned. How so? He admitted it, Ethan said, eyes dark with determination. He admitted they're pulling the strings. But that wasn't the only problem. Moments later, Ava's phone rang. It was the legal department. Argonne Capital was preparing to file a lawsuit against Carter Hospitality Group for breach of contract. The alleged violation? Ethan's reforms, which they claimed interfered with the operational agreements they had in place. The timing was precise. They weren't just trying to slow him down. They were trying to pin him in place. By the next morning, the pressure had mounted further. The board was unsettled. Some members suggested negotiating with Argonne rather than escalating the conflict. Even James Donovan, who had stood firmly with Ethan before, now seemed hesitant. This isn't just about Richard anymore, Donovan told him in a closed-door meeting. If we push too hard, Argonne could pull their funding, take legal action, or worse, we need to think long-term. Ethan didn't respond immediately. Instead, he turned to David, who had been working through the night. I found something, David said, sliding a folder across the table. A contract addendum from 3 years ago. It was buried deep in the records. Argonne slipped in a clause that gives them increased financial oversight. If we don't move fast, they're going to start leveraging that to take over more than just our policies. Ethan stared at the document. The situation had escalated beyond what he had originally prepared for. He wasn't just fighting to reform his company anymore. He was fighting to keep control of it. For the first time since this started, he wondered if he was willing to pay the cost of winning. The conference room at Carter Hospitality Group headquarters felt more like a battleground than a boardroom. Ethan Carter sat at the head of the long mahogany table, hands clasped together, his gaze sweeping over the faces in front of him. Some were tense, others unreadable, but all were waiting for his next move. To his right, Ava Mitchell had her laptop open, fingers hovering over the keyboard, ready to pull up any document needed. Across from her, David Lynn sat with a folder of reports stacked neatly in front of him. The atmosphere was thick with unspoken tension. James Donovan, normally composed, sat with his arms crossed, eyes flicking between Ethan and the other board members. He had been one of Ethan's strongest allies. But now, his loyalty seemed uncertain. We need to address the situation with Argonne Capital. Ethan began, his voice firm. They've manipulated our financial structure for years, leveraging their investments to dictate our policies. If we don't act now, we risk losing control of our own company. A murmur rippled through the room. Some nodded in agreement, others exchanged nervous glances. One of the senior board members, Evelyn Carter, an older woman who had been with the company since its inception, adjusted her glasses. Ethan, no one is denying that Argonne has overstepped, she said carefully. But are we truly in a position to fight them? Their legal team is one of the most powerful in the industry. If we go against them, we could be tied up in litigation for years. A younger board member, Marcus Vance, leaned forward. And what about the investors? He asked. If we take this public, the stock could tank. The financial risk is enormous. Ethan expected this pushback. Argonne had spent years embedding itself into the company's framework, ensuring that any attempt to remove them would be met with resistance. They're counting on us to be afraid, Ethan said, his voice steady. That's how they've kept their hold over us. But we have something they don't. He slid a thick folder across the table, flipping it open to reveal a series of documents. This, he said, pointing to the highlighted sections, is proof that Argonne has been exploiting loopholes in our financial agreements, funneling money through shell corporations, and using their influence to secure backdoor control over our assets. The room went silent. James Donovan sat up straighter, his expression shifting as he scanned the documents. Ava added, we also have evidence suggesting potential money laundering. If we make this public, Argonne won't just be facing us. They'll be facing regulatory agencies, auditors, and potentially law enforcement. Before anyone could respond, the door to the conference room opened. and a tall man in a tailored navy suit strode in. His presence alone commanded attention. He carried a sleek black folder, and the confidence in his step made it clear he wasn't here to negotiate. Jonathan Pierce, CEO of Argon Capital. I apologize for the interruption, Pierce said smoothly, his voice carrying a calculated calm. But I thought it would be better if we addressed this matter directly. Ethan leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. You're trespassing on a private board meeting. Pierce smiled, unfazed. Consider it a courtesy visit. He placed the black folder on the table. This is a legal notice from our attorneys. If Carter Hospitality continues its course of action, Argon Capital will pursue immediate litigation. The damages alone would cripple this company. Ethan didn't blink. You're trying to scare us into submission. I don't need to scare you, Pierce replied. I just need you to think rationally. Fighting us is a losing battle. He turned to James Donovan. James, you're a reasonable man. You understand the cost of going to war over this. Are you really willing to gamble the company's future over a matter of pride? Donovan hesitated, his fingers tapped lightly against the table, his mind clearly weighing the risks. Ethan could see the doubt creeping in among the board members. Pierce had chosen his moment well. Then Ava's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen, her brows knitting together. She looked up at Ethan, her expression serious. I just received the full financial analysis from our forensic team, she said. Argon Capital isn't just manipulating our contracts. They've been siphoning funds from our operations to offshore accounts. This isn't just corporate control, it's fraud. A sharp intake of breath passed through the room. Pierce's confident smirk faltered for the first time. Ethan turned to him, his voice calm but edged with steel. It seems you overplayed your hand. For the first time since this battle began, the power had shifted. The question now was whether Ethan would take the next step, one that could destroy Argon but also bring unknown consequences to Carter Hospitality. Ethan Carter sat in his office, his fingers drumming lightly against the edge of his desk. Across from him, Ava Mitchell had her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on the pile of documents between them. The weight of the decision ahead loomed over them both. The evidence was damning, proof of fraudulent financial activities, hidden transactions, and Argon Capital's systematic manipulation of Carter Hospitality Group. It was more than enough to bring regulatory scrutiny crashing down on them. But exposing it wouldn't come without consequences. Ava exhaled sharply. If we go public with this, Argon will be forced into damage control. But they won't go down quietly. They'll fight us in court, tie this up in legal battles for years. Ethan nodded, already aware of that reality. And if we do nothing, they'll continue to tighten their grip on this company. We'll never really be free. Silence stretched between them. The choice was clear. Risk an all-out war with a financial giant or let Argon maintain its foothold. A knock at the door broke the tension. James Donovan stepped inside, his expression unreadable. I've spoken to some of our major investors, he said, lowering himself into a chair. They're nervous. If this blows up in our faces, stock prices will tank. But if we handle it right, we could turn the tide. Ethan studied him for a long moment. James had been hesitant before, torn between his allegiance to Ethan and his fear of destabilizing the company. But now, there was something resolute in his tone. Ava leaned forward. We need to control the narrative. If we let the media dictate it, we risk losing leverage. But if we go on the offensive, Ethan finished her thought, we can make it clear that we're cleaning house, not just burning it down. He reached for his phone and dialed. Within minutes, he was connected to a journalist from the Financial Ledger, a respected investigative news outlet. I have something you'll want to see, Ethan said. Meet me in an hour. As soon as he hung up, he placed a second call to the Securities and Exchange Commission. I need to report corporate fraud involving a major private equity firm, he stated plainly. The words felt final, like tipping the first domino in a chain reaction. By the next morning, the story had broken. Headlines flashed across news websites and business networks. Argon Capital accused of financial misconduct in shocking corporate scandal. The stock market reacted instantly, with Argon's valuation plummeting as investors scrambled to distance themselves. Within Carter Hospitality Group, the board held an emergency session. Under mounting pressure, They voted unanimously to sever all ties with Argonne, stripping them of any remaining influence over company operations. Ethan had won, but the victory wasn't without its cost. As he sat in his office later that evening, his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "You win this round, Ethan, but in business, nothing ever truly ends." Ethan stared at the screen, the corners of his mouth tightening. He had dealt a blow to the system that had kept companies like his in chains. But he knew it wouldn't be the last battle. The fight for integrity in business was far from over. A week after the fall of Argonne Capital, Carter Hospitality Group made a formal announcement severing all ties with the disgraced investment firm. The decision sent ripples through the business world, reinforcing Ethan Carter's reputation as a leader unafraid to stand up against corporate corruption. On the morning of the press conference, the grand ballroom of the Carter Plaza Hotel was packed with journalists, investors, and industry insiders. Cameras flashed as Ethan stepped onto the stage, his expression composed, his presence commanding. Ava Mitchell stood at his side, her posture reflecting quiet confidence. James Donovan sat among the executives, no longer wavering in his support. Ethan took a moment before speaking, scanning the room, making eye contact with those who had doubted him, those who had supported him, and those who were still waiting to see if he was truly different from the rest. "We are not here today just to discuss the end of Argonne Capital's influence," he began, his voice steady. "This is about something bigger. For too long, our industry has allowed discrimination and financial manipulation to operate unchecked, hidden beneath layers of bureaucracy and profit-driven policies. That ends now." He paused, letting the words sink in. The room remained silent, everyone waiting for what came next. "This is not about removing a few bad actors. This is about changing an entire system. Today, I am announcing a complete restructuring of Carter Hospitality Group's operational policies. Effective immediately, we will implement a new ethics oversight board, ensuring that our business remains transparent and accountable to our customers and employees." A murmur spread through the audience as reporters scribbled notes. Ethan continued, his tone unwavering. "We will also be launching an industry-wide initiative to combat discrimination in hospitality. This is not just about us, it's about setting a new standard for service. One that prioritizes fairness, respect, and dignity for all." Applause erupted in sections of the room. Others remained cautious, skeptical. Some saw Ethan as a visionary, a leader pushing for meaningful change. Others suspected this was nothing more than a calculated PR move. By the afternoon, the media frenzy had reached its peak. News headlines ranged from glowing endorsements of Ethan's leadership to critical takes suggesting his reforms were more symbolic than substantive. Meanwhile, Carter Hospitality Group's stock price fluctuated, but instead of plummeting, it found stability as younger, more diverse consumers rallied behind the brand. Behind closed doors, the transition was just beginning. Ava Mitchell was promoted to executive vice president, tasked with overseeing the company's transformation. James Donovan formally pledged his full support to Ethan, no longer wavering between personal interests and corporate integrity. Employees who had upheld discriminatory policies were dismissed, while those who had stood by their principles were given new opportunities. Late that evening, as Ethan sat alone in his office, a thick envelope was delivered to his desk. No return address, no identifying marks. Inside was a stack of documents. He flipped through them, his eyes narrowing. The information detailed something far beyond Argonne Capital. Names of other firms, figures tied to powerful conglomerates. Evidence suggesting that Argonne was only one piece of a larger, more insidious network controlling industries through hidden agreements and financial coercion. At the bottom of the pile was a single handwritten note. "This was never just about one company. Watch your back." Ethan leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. He turned his gaze toward the window, where the city lights of New York stretched endlessly into the night. The battle for justice was far from over. Months had passed since the downfall of Argonne Capital, and Carter Hospitality Group had undergone a transformation. Le Jardin, once a symbol of exclusivity and hidden prejudice, now stood at the forefront of a movement toward ethical service. The changes extended beyond just policies, they reshaped the very foundation of how the company operated. Sales, which had initially dipped due to uncertainty, had not only recovered but surged. Younger, socially conscious customers now viewed the brand as a leader in corporate responsibility. Business executives who once preferred discretion now chose Carter hospitality venues as a statement of progressive values. Investors who had once hesitated were now reaching out, eager to associate with a company that had proven it could stand against corruption and thrive. At the heart of these changes was a newfound sense of accountability. Every restaurant in the chain had implemented advanced tracking systems to monitor service interactions, ensuring fairness and transparency. Employee training programs had been overhauled, with a strict zero-tolerance policy against discrimination. More than just a business strategy, it was a cultural shift, one that Ethan Carter had fought to make permanent. Sitting in his office, Ethan watched as the city skyline stretched before him, the lights of New York flickering like a silent reminder of battles fought and those still to come. Ava Mitchell entered, carrying a tablet loaded with the latest financial reports. She placed it on his desk but didn't sit, her expression thoughtful. "Do you think we really changed anything?" she asked. Ethan leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "We changed something," he said, "but the system doesn't crumble overnight. There will always be those who want to hold on to their power, to keep things the way they were." Ava crossed her arms. "And what's next? Do we just keep fighting until there's no one left to fight?" Ethan reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a single piece of paper. The anonymous letter he had received weeks ago. He placed it between them, his fingers tapping lightly against the surface. "Next," he said, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We find out who's really pulling the strings." As he stood, buttoning his jacket, the city hummed beyond the glass windows. The air was crisp, the streets below alive with movement. Across the street, a black car idled near the curb, its tinted windows concealing the occupants inside. Inside the vehicle, a middle-aged man with sharp features watched as Ethan exited the building. He picked up his phone, his voice calm but firm. "He's not stopping. We have a problem." Ethan stepped into the elevator, the doors sliding shut as the gears of a larger battle began to turn. The war for justice was far from over. It had only just begun. Power doesn't come from a title, it comes from actions. Ethan Carter didn't just expose one corrupt employee, he revealed a system that had been broken for far too long. His story isn't just about a restaurant, it's about the choices we make when faced with injustice. Do we stay silent, or do we stand up and demand change? What would you do in his place? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories that uncover the truth, don't forget to subscribe to Undercover Truths, because sometimes the real story is the one they don't want you to see.